Hello, I'm John Nichols, and for 42 years I was an English GP or family doctor. And now that I'm retired from that, I spend most of my time doing research and writing. And I have a question for you. And the question is nutritional medicine flaky science? And there seem to be a lot of people who are prepared to say it is flaky science, so maybe not as many as 50 years ago, when already I was involved in the world of medicine. Don't confuse nutritional medicine with alternative medicines such as homeopathy and herbology. Their scientific basis is not as strong as nutritional medicine, you see, because nutritional medicine is based on nutrition science, which is well represented in the universities and the research papers. The research in the areas of homeopathy and herbology is not so impressive, shall we say. So, what is the difference between nutrition science and nutritional medicine? They are just two sides of the same coin, really. Nutrition science is all about research, and the other side of the coin, nutritional medicine, is about putting it into practice in clinical medicine. So you may do one or the other, or occasionally you do both. Now, there seem to be a lot of pills on sale as supplements, and there is criticism of the supplement industry as going too far. Well, look at all the things on this shelf, and the householder maybe has a look and he has a little bit of a problem deciding, should he be taking all of these, or some of them some of the time, or some of them all of the time, or what? It is confusing. And if your GP isn't much help in this respect, what are you to do? Well, you can always read up nutritional medicine. The critics of nutritional medicine are many, and it is difficult sometimes to answer their criticisms. Ben Goldacre, a consultant psychiatrist and author whose best-selling book is Bad Science, really damning about nutrition science and nutritionists. Nutrition science, remember, is what goes on in universities and laboratories. Media nutritionists that he's attacking here are on the nutritional medicine side. They're practitioners on the whole. He says media nutritionists speak with just a grain of science, but all too often it's like the difference between astrology and astronomy. Because astronomy is real science and astrology is mainly superstition. And he's obviously implying that nutritionists are closer to the astrologer and superstition rather than hard science. Dr. Edward Archer, who is a scientist at the famous Mayo Clinic and an author, has said, and this is controversial, he says controversies regarding the putative health effects, putative means supposed health effects of dietary sugar, salt, fat, and cholesterol are not derived by legitimate differences in scientific inference from valid evidence, but by fictional discourse on diet-disease relations. That is a very controversial statement, and one that, although some people would agree with, many people would find was going too far. Dr. Amy Sibar et al. In a multi-author paper in the Journal of Nutrition sounds a note of caution about methodology in nutrition science that we tend to rely upon as if it is hard science. No, she says, dietary self-report data suffer from measurement errors so great that findings from all dietary surveillance and observational studies are useless for informing public health policy or investigating diet-health relations. Throw it in the bin, she says, and it's about half of all that's going on in nutrition science. I don't entirely agree with that, and I'll explain why later. Tim Harford, OBE, who is well-known BP presenter of a statistics program, more or less, has also some hard things to say about this side of nutrition science. I'll come on to that later. First of all, one answer to the critics of nutrition science is often heard in the circles that I move in, and that is, we are a very young science, says this old professor. We are a very young science, even though I'm an old professor, he might say. And that is true because nutrition science didn't really get going until well into the 20th century. It had its beginnings in the 19th century, but it didn't really get going in an impressive way until well into the 20th century, as opposed to chemistry, physics, biology, which were going strong more than 100 years before. So give us a break, we're a young science. And despite that, there have been some impressive advances. Let's look at a few of them. First of all, the role of preconception folic acid, which is a form of vitamin B9, in the prevention of birth defects. Some rather horrible birth defects called neural tube defects or spina bifida can be largely prevented by preconception folic acid as a tablet, not just saying bump it up in your diet. That's not enough. We have established that dietary factors are significant in many conditions previously judged to be psychosomatic. All in the mind, they were saying, and they were wrong. Irritable bowel syndrome and migraine are two good examples. Irritable bowel syndrome can be treated with a special diet called the low FODMAP diet. And 70% of cases of irritable bowel syndrome improve on dietary management, which surely couldn't be true if it was really psychosomatic. We now have proof that artificial food additives like tartrazine and sunset yellow can have an adverse effect on both children and even adults. This has been suspected for a long time. A lot of research testing one artificial additive at a time failed to show a problem. But it was when researchers got wise to the fact that it's combinations of these chemicals that act together to produce side effects. So it's no good at all testing one at a time. We now have a lot of proof that dietary fiber is more than a bulking agent. It has chemical effects that protect against obesity and diabetes. And this is ongoing research, so watch this space. We now have an increased understanding of gene-nutrient interactions in health, i.e. there is a gene for lactose intolerance, which is a relatively recent discovery. And it is possible that this testing for this gene will replace some rather unpleasant tests that are usually done in a hospital environment, whereas just the quick buccal swab could tell you if you've got this gene or not. We have an increased understanding of nutritional factors in osteoporosis. It's more than just vitamin D, and Professor Lanham New, who is in the Department of Nutrition Science that I've been involved with, has done a lot of research to show this, that in fact, fruit and vegetable intake are protective against osteoporosis, and too much meat can be a risk factor. And vitamin D is important as well, and calcium, of course. But talking of vitamin D, we now have evidence for health benefits of taking a vitamin D supplement throughout the winter months when we are not able to manufacture vitamin D from sunlight. and that is probably going to protect us against nasty viruses to some extent, including COVID-19. Going back to Tim Harford, whose program more or less I'm a great fan of, I was dismayed last year to hear him have a go at nutrition science. In an interview with Christy Ashwandon, an American journalist and former lead scientist at 5038, which I don't read myself, but apparently is a pretty with it wake little journal, they discussed nutrition science, the use of diet diaries, and research that shows correlation between diet, health, and disease, such as cancers. And they concluded that the whole science is inaccurate and unreliable. I was so dismayed at this because I have used diet diaries in my own research that I wrote to Tim Harford, but I never heard back from him. This is what I did, and this is quite different from what he described as being inaccurate and unreliable. I used a weighed diet diary in patients, in young women who were with it, intelligent and able to do this slightly tricky daily routine. So this is what you do. You take your electronic scales, switch them on, of course. You put a plate on the scales, and then you zero it. You press the zero button so that the weight of the plate is cancelled. Then this is my Saturday evening meal. A lovely steak and kidney pie. And before you criticize my choice, this is a very good source of the micronutrient selenium. And I enjoy steak and kidney pies as an occasional treat. You then zero the scales again. So you're starting from scratch again, having made a note of the weight of the pie. You then put on the peas, record the weight, and again, return it to zero. And finally, a dollop of mashed potato, you record the weight. And that is, the meal is complete. And you put that in your diet diary, an accurately weighed diet diary. Now, you might go out for a meal so that it's more difficult. It's not impossible to go through this procedure in a restaurant, but another alternative is to take a photograph of what you're about to eat and make as good as possible a guesstimate of the constituents. And some convenience foods that are in wrappers, if you keep the wrapper, it tells you what the constituents are, how much they weigh, and something about their nutritional content. All of this is recorded in the diet diary for 7 days. You then enter all the details into a special computer program, such as Diet Plan 6. This is software that can be entered on any up-to-date computer. And this calculates the daily intake of all nutrients. It tells you the daily amount averaged over the 7 days of your intake of different vitamins, different micronutrients such as zinc, selenium, magnesium, all the important micronutrients, as well as the macronutrients, protein, starch, and dietary fiber. And there are 4 different ways of measuring dietary fiber because, as I've already implied, dietary fiber is not a simple bulking agent, it is the chemically active constituent. And then this can be fed into a statistical program used to determine the significance of individual nutrients in relation to health outcomes. You could, for instance, be interested in the nutrient intake in relation to appendicitis or to migraine, or as in the case of the research I was doing, in relation to female fertility. And what I found from my research is just a small trial of this 7-day diet diary was that selenium seemed to come up trumps as being a fertility factor. and cadmium, an anti-nutrient that works its way into our food as an anti-nutrient, was a negative factor for fertility. And this was backed up by the results of blood tests as well. So are dietaries nonsense and should be thrown in the dustbin? No, diaries can be done scientifically and accuracy, and the critics are in fact wrong. So what do you believe? Who do you believe? Do you believe me? Nutrition science, nutritional medicine, how do I know who to trust? Well, you have to look at the literature, really. You have to read it up. There are 3 strands of evidence for nutritional medicine, and if all 3 are accounted for in the scientific literature, then it's reliable, evidence-based nutritional medicine. And it may be better than taking drugs in some circumstances. So these are the 3 strands. And remember, 3 strands twisted together give a really strong cord there, whereas 1 strand on its own is not so strong. So this is a good analogy for reliable scientific evidence. The first strand, what usually comes first, is observational nutritional science. And a diet diary is, after all, observational. It showed, in my case, a correlation between selenium and female fertility. It didn't prove it for absolute certainty because it was just observational. Proving it would be the next step in the scientific process. And the next strand is biochemistry. Nutrition science involves a lot of biochemistry in the laboratory, looking at the metabolic pathways. And taking the example of selenium again, we do know that selenium is involved in a metabolic pathway that cancels out toxins, heavy metals, free radicals, called the selenoprotein pathway. And we know all about that pathway. So we've got 2 strands now, and the final strand will be a clinical trial. And the gold standard for clinical trials in the past has always been that you compare the real thing that you're giving, which would be selenium, with a placebo, which is a dummy tablet which looks just the same but contains no active ingredient, no selenium, for instance. And this is blinded, which means that neither the doctors doing the trial or the patients taking part in it know whether they're taking the real thing or the placebo. And a third party somewhere, usually a senior pharmacist, holds the key to the blinding of the trial. And only when the trial is complete do they unblind it to find out who was taking what. And we've seen recently this being done with trials of COVID vaccine, so that you're randomized to either having the real vaccine or just an injection of salty water. And you don't know which you've had until the end of the trial. At the same time, for me in particular, Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection is always there in the background. It leads you to ask questions, important questions, why and how things happened. Like, why is asthma getting so much more frequent nowadays? There's something in the environment that we're not adapted to. Our Stone Age ancestors gave us a certain genetic profile which has changed very little since then. And that's what the lifestyle we're adapted to. So there's been a change in the environment. And in the case of asthma, eventually it can be tracked down to, in many cases, to indoor pollution. Indoor pollution, not outdoor pollution, may be a factor too, in extreme cases like some cities in China, very important. But indoor pollution is often a big part of asthma that you see in routine general practice. So Charles Darwin, for me, is always there in the background. Now, here's an example of the 3 strands. And this is, I'm going back to the congenital birth defects due to lack of vitamin B9, folate. Folic acid is the version that's given as a supplement. This is chemically stable. A slightly different chemical version of folate is what is in our diet. So initially, epidemiology on the whole and some observational studies back in the 1960s and early 70s, including two researchers that I actually knew, Brian Hibbard and Dick Smithles there, when I was a medical student in Liverpool, and they were very efficient, effective teaching consultants doing this research, showed good reason to think that the cause of these horrible birth defects was folate deficiency. But that was observational, it didn't prove it for certain. At about the same time, other researchers, guys that I didn't know, McCulley, Banderjee, and Morgan, were showing that there was a metabolic pathway which required folate. And if you don't have enough folate in your diet, the metabolic pathway malfunctions, which is pretty serious because this metabolic pathway is necessary for DNA synthesis and many other key components of the general metabolic pathways, particularly those involved in the early development of the human embryo. So this is beginning to make sense. But in the end, you have to nail the argument with a large double-blind randomized control of folic acid versus placebo, which is exactly what was done with a large grant from the Medical Research Council in the UK, involving 1,871 women who were given either placebo or a dose of folic acid in the run-up to a planned pregnancy. And this really nailed it. It has, since then, it has been standard government policy to advise all women to take folic acid when they are preparing to get pregnant, not wait till they're pregnant, because that's like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. Before you are pregnant, before you know you are pregnant, but you are already pregnant, that is when the folate is needed most to get the correct development of the neural tube and prevent this defect. Now, what about when you have a situation where you get really good evidence from epidemiology, for instance, that vitamin E intake or low vitamin E intake is related to heart attack risk, but you haven't got anything else to go by. The other two strands are missing. That is when I would say, look at it through the eyes of Charles Darwin. Think in terms of where we come from as a human species, our Stone Age ancestry and pre-Stone Age ancestry as mammals, and consider what aspect of natural selection is at work here. And that will point you in the right direction for looking for further evidence, for looking at the metabolic pathways and deciding what sort of research still needs to be done, including the final trial, whether it be a placebo double-blind trial or something. Some modern form of research are a little more sophisticated, in my opinion, but I won't go into that now. If you want to know more, you should consider buying one or both of my books on the subject. Well, at any rate, check out my website, which is there, a Wix site, and you'll see there are excerpts from my two books on nutritional science and nutritional medicine. There are also a page of my research, including my research in some of the areas I have described. So do check out my website, and I think you'll find some interesting stuff there. Goodbye.